Thanks so much, Doris. I just shared my screen. So thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. And thank you to Sierra Club Water Sentinels, Doris, for inviting me to speak today. So I'm Mary Grant, the Public Water for All campaign director at Food and Water Watch. I work with our team of organizers across the country on campaigns to support safe, affordable, and publicly controlled water across the country. Today, I'm going to talk about the fight for local control of water. I'll start with an overview of water privatization, and then I'll highlight some corporate threats and strategies and provide some solutions at the end. I'll take questions also at the end. So let's talk about water privatization. First, I want to level set with a definition. Water privatization can be used pretty broadly to talk about the various ways that corporations are controlling water, like through bottled water or water markets. But today, when I say water privatization, I mean the transfer of control of public water and sewer systems, the utility systems, to for-profit corporations. Sometimes when I talk about water privatization, people are shocked. They are unaware that private utilities even exist. That's because most people in the United States receive their water service from a publicly owned system, usually their local government. Nearly 90% of people who are on a water system, so if you're not on a household well, you get your water service from a publicly owned utility. And more than 95% of people get their wastewater service from a publicly owned treatment work. There are significant regional differences in private control of water systems. There is very little private ownership in the South, in the Plains, and in Michigan. In comparison, some states have a lot of privately owned water systems. New Jersey, for example, has 40% of people who get their water service from a corporate provider. There are a lot of reasons why private water or public water prevails nationally and why privatization is so uncommon in the United States. It's from control of decision-making and investments to lower costs and better regional coordination. Historically, though, many of our nation's water systems, from New York City to San Francisco to Chicago to Philadelphia, they were all actually privately controlled, and it was a disaster. For example, in New York City, the predecessor of the bank, JP Morgan Chase, used to control the water supply. The city took it over in the 1800s after a cholera epidemic killed 3,500 people, and huge fires caused massive property destruction. The company was blamed because it refused to extend water service to low-income tenement areas of the city where it didn't think it could make money. In the 1800s and the early 1900s, thousands of cities across the country took control of their water systems from private entities to improve water quality, lower costs, and provide more equitable service. Overall, public water has led to better access and improved water quality, helping to prevent the spread of diseases. Local governments extended water lines to low-income and Black communities in particular that had been historically excluded by private companies. One analysis found that public ownership of water systems cut typhoid rates in Black communities in the South by as much as 42%. Privatization can take a number of forms. I like to think of it on a scale of how much control is transferred away from local governments to a for-profit entity. Systems can be fully owned and operated by your local government to various forms of what are known as public-private partnerships, contracts, to full outright private ownership, the most extreme form of privatization, like investor-owned utilities. The figures and statistics I talked about earlier were all about this most extreme form of privatization, private ownership. Public-private partnerships fall in that middle and involve public ownership, so you retain that local ownership, but you privatize operations, maintenance, and sometimes financing under concession deals. Most privatization contracts are short-term, 2 to 5 year operations and maintenance contracts. It is very rare to have private financing involved because private financing is very expensive. The water privatization sector is pretty consolidated. There are 3 main players who operate across state lines and aggressively seek to privatize public municipal systems. The largest private water operator in the United States is Veolia. This is also the world's largest water privatizer. It recently bought and took over its main competitor, Suez, which had operated in the United States as United Water. And as a result, it now outpaces American Water and serves the largest number of people in the country among private providers. Veolia's latest sustainability report says that it serves 18 million people with water and sewer service in North America. American Water is the largest investor-owned utility based in the United States, whereas Veolia has a lot of those privatization contracts, public-private partnership deals to run city-owned systems. American Water almost exclusively owns and operates its systems. It serves about 14 million people. And Essential Utilities is the next biggest with 5.5 million people served. It used to be known as Aqua America, but changed its name when it acquired and merged with Peoples Gas Company a couple years ago. So what's at risk when you privatize your water system? The heart of the issue is about who controls the system, who makes the big decisions about where to extend lines, what investments to prioritize and where, who gets their lead service lines replaced first, how do we charge for service, and so much more. It's about accountability and transparency in those decisions. With public control, you have access to meetings where decisions are made and direct communication with the decision makers. You can email the mayor, the city council. But with private control, you are cut out of that process. It's a black box of a corporate boardroom, which is exempt from state transparency laws. You cannot FOIA the CEO of American Water. You cannot FOIA the CEO of Veolia. And water prices are approved not by the city council, but usually by appointed officials at the public utility commissions. And the process is very difficult for regular folks to engage in. You often need a lawyer to actually intervene in a rate case. And in terms of water prices, we found, like every other academic study out there, that private water is so much more expensive than local government service. We compiled the data for the 500 largest community water systems and found that on average, among these large systems, private water charges 59% more than local governments for the same amount of water. Researchers from Cornell University found that not only do privately owned systems charge statistically higher rates, but they also found that private ownership was the single biggest factor associated with higher rates, even more than drought, even more than aging infrastructure. And the key reason is corporate profit. Big corporations earn a rate of return on their investment of around 10%. State regulators add them to allow that 10% onto the cost of every single improvement project and every new acquisition, every new system they buy up. They pass all of that on and the cost of taxes, income taxes, property taxes, onto customers through higher water rates. Okay, so those are the problems with privatization. But now I'm going to talk about some of the threats that we're seeing from these private water companies and what their main strategies are that they're using to try to privatize your public water systems. Basically, this is what you should be on the lookout for in your state and your community. The big corporate water players are very aggressive right now. They are targeting cash-strapped communities in particular. They often offer large sums of money to entice a city or a town to privatize. Again, all that money plus profit will be recovered through hikes in customer water bills. They also are targeting states that have emergency management or state or federal oversight. So this emergency management, like what happened in Michigan, or state or federal oversight, can force systems into privatization. This actually happened in Jackson, Mississippi last year. An imposed manager privatized the system's operations to Jacobs. And residents in Jackson just won a lawsuit to actually have a voice in that process and to intervene in that federal oversight of their system. Investor-owned utilities are also particularly targeting sewer systems in their water system service area. So they're buying up, if they already serve you water, they'll try to take over your sewer system. We're seeing a lot of sewer privatizations in Pennsylvania in particular. They also seek what are known as like tuck-in acquisitions, where they're buying up water and sewer systems in wealthy suburban areas right next to their existing service area. And these companies are focusing on a handful of states where they have successfully passed corporate-friendly laws and regulations. And on that note, a big factor that is driving water privatization are these corporate-friendly laws and regulations. The companies have been super successful lobbying for changes that make it easier and more profitable to buy systems and then hike your rates after privatization. They are focused mostly at the state level, but they have a couple of federal priorities. And there are quite a few of these laws, often usually with titles that have flowery language that can obscure what the legislation actually does. So at the federal level, their big piece of legislation is called the Clean Water SRF Parity Act. Sounds nice, right? From Representative Garamendi. But what it actually does is opens up federal wastewater funding to investor-owned utilities. Historically, since the beginning of the wastewater construction grant program in the mid 1900s, these funds have all been dedicated for publicly owned treatment works. The companies want that money, which would take limited federal dollars away from our struggling local government sewer systems. This would, in particular, put the bipartisan infrastructure fund dollars up for private grabs. At the state level, they are pursuing 4 main legislative priorities. Number 1, fair market value legislation. Sounds good, right? But it inflates the value of a system, allowing companies to offer even higher purchase prices to entice cities to sell and leading to higher profits for the company. And all of this gets automatically added to their rate base without regulatory oversight to see if it's in the public interest. And that means that they can recover it all on the backs of ratepayers who see even larger and larger water bills. And then they're also looking at legislation called the Water Quality Accountability Act. Also, that sounds good, right? Like it was first passed in New Jersey, but what it does is it poses onerous and unnecessary paperwork burden in order to strong arm smaller systems into privatization without actually requiring improvements in water quality. They also are seeking consolidated rates between drinking water and wastewater services. So they want to charge their drinking water customers the cost of buying up all those sewer systems they're targeting. And then lastly, they want to remove referendum requirements. They want to cut the public out of decision-making and strip away democracy in these big decisions. Like Alexandria talked about earlier, this is a big public approval, a big mechanism that residents should have before privatization. So, but companies are getting rid of it. Some states never had it. Pennsylvania never had it. New Jersey used to have it until Chris Christie signed into law WIPA, the Water Infrastructure Protection Act. Again, another flowery sounding good name, completely misleading. What it did, it curtailed a century-old law that granted the public an automatic right to referendum on the privatization of their water and sewer system. They've done this in other states, removing the public's right to vote on these deals. So that's what you should look out for at the state level. But what should you look out for in your community in particular? So these companies often track infrastructure issues and make pitches based on what they see in the local news. Some of them, like American Water, are currently speculating that the new PFAS regulations that Doris and Alexandra talked about earlier, in particular, will drive more and more communities to privatization. However, privatization is the most expensive way to make an improvement project, like an activated carbon filtration or reverse osmosis treatment system improvement to remove PFAS. It's not only because privatization is more expensive than public borrowing, but also because you have to repay the purchase price that the company gives the city for the system. So not only you're paying for the improvement, but you're also paying for the entire cost of the system again. And all of that comes with a 10% markup after taxes for corporate profits. The companies also target cities with well-run water systems if the city itself has budget concerns, outstanding unrelated water debts, or generally an anti-tax sentiment. So this is happening right now in Chester. Companies are targeting the Chester Water Authority, a well-run system, because the city of Chester has budget deficits. Most communities we see that privatize don't do so because the water system has issues, but they do so because the mayor wants to avoid raising taxes for unrelated projects or wants to fund a pet redevelopment project with that one-time infusion of cash from the sale of the utility. This is what we call taxing through the tap. It's non-transparent and it's fiscally irresponsible. It's not a good way to raise general fund money, especially at a time when we're seeing a nationwide water affordability crisis. And another thing to look out for is just the mayor's politics, including that anti-tax sentiment or pro-developer positions, as well as the mayor's activities. These companies, these big water corporations, can often fund conferences like the Mayor's Water Council to pitch privatization. They like to wine and dine elected officials to make their sales pitch. So what are the solutions? These are large companies. What can we do to resist them? Well, first know that you and your neighbors have power to stop these deals, despite the millions of dollars that these companies have spent lobbying for pro-privatization legislation and trying to sway public officials, hundreds of communities have won and defeated privatization efforts. They've used a variety of strategies, like to help guard against privatization, including strengthening local laws to require a public vote, like in Atlantic City, or outright banning water privatization, like in Edison, New Jersey, and Baltimore. I'm going to talk about Baltimore, which has been working to address its own issues with water affordability and water quality. In the middle of its water affordability crisis, before a new water affordability program launched in the fall of 2017, Suez, which is now owned by that big company Veolia, and the Wall Street private equity firm KKR, targeted Baltimore for a long-term lease concession of its water and sewer system. Water privatization would have deepened Baltimore's water affordability crisis. Because of the profit requirements and the higher cost of private financing, it typically costs an average of 59% more. And KKR and Suez were actually really clear when they approached Baltimore city officials that rates would go up, and they would go up proportionately to the amount of money that the city wanted to get in exchange for the deal. So that's what's at stake. They were very clear. We'll give you money, and how much money we'll give you is dependent on how much we can hike rates on households. So the community came together to ban water privatization. In 2018, the then mayor drafted a charter amendment to declare that the water system is an inalienable asset of the city. The city council unanimously approved it and sent it to voters. That November, 77% of voters in Baltimore City approved ballot question E to help make Baltimore the first major city to outright ban water privatization. But I want to be clear that even within our coalition space, we knew that this was not a vote that the water system was perfect. It was a commitment to work together to find public solutions. Another example is Atlantic City. In 2017, by a nearly unanimous vote, so 8-0 with one abstention, the City Council of Atlantic City passed an ordinance demanding a public vote on sale of their municipal water system. It was a direct challenge to the state takeover of Atlantic City, engineered by then Governor Chris Christie. The takeover gave the state broad powers, including the ability to sell that well-run water system to private corporations with deep political connections to leaders in both parties. So the AC Citizens Against the State Takeover came together to ensure that any sale of the water system was put up to the public vote, a right that was granted to any other municipality in the state, except those under state takeovers and under that new bad WIPA process. This campaign was supported by my organization, Food and Water Watch, as well as the ACLU of New Jersey, the Atlantic City chapter of the NAACP, and the Appleseed Public Interest Law Center. The campaign went door to door, neighbor to neighbor, to collect petitions necessary to make sure that Atlantic City residents were given a voice in controlling the resources that belonged to them. And then, because of that show of power, even Chris Christie backed off. In addition to stopping privatization, communities can actually reverse privatization, but it is a lot harder to do. This public sector solution is something we call municipalization, or the purchase of a privately owned system by a local government or public entity. It's harder to do, but it actually happens more often than privatization, though. Small private systems are frequently bought up by local governments to improve water service and lower costs. One good example of this is the Florida Governmental Utility Authority, which was created specifically to buy these small, terrible private systems and improve them before transferring them over to their local governments. It's consolidation, improvement, and then a return to local control. It's an interesting model, and it has been used on more than 100 small systems, including some that have been previously owned by some of the biggest investor-owned utilities. This authority bought almost all of Aqua Utilities' Florida water systems, when the company, now called Essential Utilities, exited the entire state of Florida. After considerable public opposition to their poor service and high rates, the seniors in Florida got up in arms and kicked the company out of the state, and they sold it to the Florida Governmental Utility Authority. Overall, we know that many of our water and sewer systems are old and need major updates. We see it every day. When water main breaks, flooding roads and homes, as sewage spills contaminate our precious waterways and back up into homes. Every year, there are more than 250,000 water main breaks, wasting more than 2 trillion gallons of water a year. There are tens of thousands of sewer overflows, spilling billions upon billions of gallons of raw sewage. We know that our public utilities need support to help with urgent public new health regulations like removing PFAS and replacing all lead service lines. But from 1977 to 2017, federal funding fell 77% in real terms. That's an 84% cut on a per capita basis, a per person basis. The bipartisan infrastructure law provided a big boost in funding for water, but it was only 7% of the need that was identified at the time. And our water needs keep growing. A more recent drinking water needs survey, even before the PFAS MCLs or maximum contaminant levels were put in place, found that water system needs have shot up by more than 30%. It's clear it will not be enough, and we need dedicated assistance for safe water for all. That's why Food and Water Watch supports the Water Act, the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act in Congress to create a trust fund to provide dedicated federal funding at a level that is necessary based on the latest EPA needs survey. It would provide more than $35 billion each and every year to public water systems, wastewater systems, household wells, septic systems, and school water infrastructure. And it is funded through a small rollback on the Trump administration's corporate income tax cuts. A 3.5 percentage point increase in the corporate income tax rate could fully meet the needs of our water systems across the country. And this is just a small rollback of those corporate tax cuts too. So it really centers the questions of the priorities for our country. Importantly, the Water Act will also counter corporate control of water by providing resources so they can improve their water systems on their own, removing corporate separate subsidies, and supporting community-led efforts to exit privatization deals and buy their water systems from corporations. So I think fundamentally, I want to make the case that we need to change how we fund water. We need to use progressive revenue streams to support system projects and operations. Water bills are one of the most regressive bills we pay. It disproportionately burdens low-income families who pay a higher portion of their earnings just for water. So I'm happy to take questions. I'll stop my share here.
Well, the first question I saw from Debbie, do you think that small drinking water systems having problems with MCL violations are being pushed to consolidate?
Yes. That's a great question, Debbie. And yes, we are seeing that the EPA and states do try to encourage these smaller systems to consolidate. What we think consolidation can work if it's done under the public sector, like Charlotte-Mecklenburg Utility Authority or Charlotte-Mecklenburg water system in North Carolina is a good example of that. But it needs to be done under public control and with community voices included in that process. It can't be imposed on communities. What we're seeing is that a lot of historically disinvested in communities, majority Black communities, are being targeted for consolidation to have their assets stripped away to target the decision-making power of Black elected officials. And so that's something we would really raise up as a big red flag, is that we don't want EPA to impose consolidation on communities. We want to make sure that the process is democratic and it's done with under public control.
Another question is, what is the status of HR 250? It was very alarming to think that Biden infrastructure funds would be given to private entities. And is there support to opposing it? I mean, are we going to get rid of that bill?
Yeah, so we keep beating it back. So Garamendi is not giving up on it. We stopped it from being included in the Water Resources Development Act. He tried to move it first he tried to move it last year as a standalone bill. And it was going to get a vote as a standalone bill, as like a non-controversial issue that Republicans and Democrats can come together in the House and pass and move. And we were like, hey, this is actually really controversial. We want to protect funding for our public wastewater systems. And we were able to stop it then. Then he was talking about how he wanted to include it in the Water Resources Development Act, which is a biannual must-pass water resources bill. Fortunately, that bill will only address Army Corps projects, and they're not going to talk about policy decisions like this that are very controversial. So we stopped it then. And then Garamendi just earlier this year tried to move it again. There was a really bad anti-clean water permitting bill that the House passed earlier this year to gut Clean Water Act protections. He tried to move it along with that. He's supposed to be a Democrat. He's from California, but he was trying to have his bill run along with this really partisan anti-clean water bill. But because we were able to muck it up, he actually removed his amendment to add it at the last minute during the committee hearing. And so it was not moved through the House at that time. But he is still looking for every chance he gets to move this bill. But there is strong opposition from, I think it's more than 200 organizations across the country who oppose it. We're working closely with the Public Sector Workers Union, ASHME in particular.
I see a question from Stacy Fortner.
Yeah, it's a little bit too much to type, but first let me apologize. I have workers outside, so if my dogs bark, just please help me ignore them. They're driving me crazy. So my question is related to one of the more deceitful ways to sneak in water privatization, and it's getting more popular, and it's getting some more, I guess, more attention, and that is around desalination. And I don't think that people understand that these desal plants are not public owned, that these are privately owned corporations. And while it sounds great that, we'll have all of this water that we can take advantage of and use for our houses and our showers and washing our clothes, it's really more of a move to privatize our water, create profits for these corporations, leave our planet less clean and healthy than it was prior, and also have us, the ratepayers, pay astronomical rates for these, because those plants are not cheap to operate. So wanted to get, what are your thoughts around that? I mean, those are my personal thoughts and research that I've done, but what do you see?
I completely agree. And that we're seeing that a lot, particularly in California and Florida. And there's also new brackish desalination plant ideas being brought up. Like they were thinking about it in New Orleans when there was that saltwater intrusion for their water supply. So it's coming up across the country. I think it's most significant in California. So desalination is one of, if not the most expensive water supply option. So, and it is almost always privatized. Like Poseidon is a huge corporation that specializes in these desalination plants. American Water's trying to desperately build a desalination plant in Monterey County, and an environmental justice community to serve not that community, but to serve wealthier areas outside of the environmental justice community. It is currently in court too, but the desalination plant in Monterey is really interesting too, because it's going to be used by American Water to drive up the cost of municipalization fight there. Folks in Monterey for like more than a decade have been trying to buy their water system from American Water. And they want to do it in part to stop the desalination plant too. They have alternatives that are lower cost that they're pursuing, and they want the company to pursue, but they're going after desalination because if your system's privately owned, these high cost water treatment plants allow them to make more money because they make a rate of return on how much money they spend on their investment. So this is where the profit motive comes in. They're pursuing these really wasteful, expensive, environmentally damaging projects like desalination. It not only is the most expensive, but it uses so much energy too to have these high power pressure membranes. Reverse osmosis to remove the salt. It's very expensive, and ocean desalination in particular is extremely expensive because of the salinity of the water and how much you also have all the waste brines that they often just dump into the ocean, killing a lot of the ecosystems along the ocean. It's a terrible process, and it's often used as an excuse. Like, we'll make this alternative water supply instead of addressing water issues head on. Hey, maybe we shouldn't have big oil, big ag waste all of our water. Maybe we need to be smarter about the water that we do have so that we're not looking at these really energy intensive, wasteful water supply alternatives. The best thing to do is always to use the water you have more wisely. It should be always the first stop, is to use the water you have more wisely. Stormwater capture, replacing water lines, reducing leakage. These should be always the first line defense when you have water supply shortages. And then also we need to go after those corporate water abusers. We have a big campaign in California trying to get the governor to take on big ag and big oil that's wasting a lot of water. I mean, California's gotten a lot of rain recently, but we know drought is going to come back. And so we need to prioritize going after wasteful water uses instead of these really wasteful and privatized desalination projects and other alternative water supply projects. So again, it's like a statement of like where our priorities are. Are we going to keep making the public pay more and more money to give corporations hand out these big boondoggle of projects? Or are we going to actually go after the real corporate water abusers?
Maryland,
I live in Los Angeles, just so you know.
Yeah.
Maryland has asked about what she calls, excuse me, the financialization of human rights, such as housing and water and sanitation, making them into asset classes. And this is a perspective I have not heard about.
Yeah, so this is really interesting. We're seeing a lot of what's known as financialization of nature in particular. So I track it more from like water perspective, the financialization of water. One key way that's happening right now with water is the water futures market. The world's first water futures market was launched in December of 2020, right after the historic droughts in California. So CME, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, self-certified this new financial product to allow speculators to gamble on water prices in California after the devastating wildfire season and historic droughts they had there. And it's, again, this is allowing these financial speculators to gamble on and control our essential resources. Another one was there was a proposal that actually got removed, fortunately, recently, to create natural asset companies on the stock exchange. So this would be companies who would own nature and then trade it and like turn it into stocks, nature. So this is a really horrifying development. Fortunately, it was stopped. I think it was stopped for the wrong reasons. A lot of, I'm not clear on it, but I think it wasn't for the reasons that we would stop it. But it was pulled back. There was a lot of opposition from both sides on this issue. And I think we're going to see more and more of it, especially with climate change. The climate change is putting a lot of pressures on our water supplies, both in terms of some communities get too much water, some communities have too little, and it's overall degrading the quality of the water that we have, as well as on our ecosystems. And so there's a lot of companies out there who want to try to monetize and financialize our ecosystems, which can be really dangerous. We see that with the housing crisis, right? Like when you have a lot of rental properties now are owned by private equity, and it's causing a really big housing crisis across the country. Rents are going up, and it's driven by this private equity control of the housing market. That happened during the pandemic. They came in and they swooped in and bought up a lot of housing stock. So I think we're going to see that happen with water and with nature more broadly, and we really need to be on the guard against it.
Richard Freeman asked, is there a chance that at the end of extraction of public waters by private corporations, this would be legislated and maybe turned into I'm not sure what this means, but it's like the role of the Forest Service. I think, it was sort of like, will there be an effort to put this into some kind of institution?
Mm-hmm. I think something needs to happen. There's a lot of proposals about like creating like a Department of Water, because a lot of water data is so segregated in like different agencies hold different water data. There's no centralized piece, no centralized agency tracking it all. There's no agency tracking ownership of water systems. EPA is supposed to, but it's like the data on it's not great. There's no centralized agency tracking things like water shutoffs or even water rights. So we were in conversations with some congressional offices about this idea. How do we stop big banks and these private equity funds from buying up actual water rights along the Colorado River? That's another trend we're seeing. A lot of Wall Street investors like Greenstone Capital, there's Water Asset Management, super interested in buying land, often from farmers who fallowed their land during the pandemic. They came in, they swooped in, bought up the land, not to get the land itself, but to get the underlying water rights. And then they're selling that water rights to big developers, to new subdivisions, to really wasteful, new sprawling developments. So how do we actually do that? So we weren't able to find a solution at the federal level because of federalism, right? Because water rights are treated as property rights issues, and so it's regulated at the state level. There are state level regulations that we do support. The key one is about making sure that water is held as a public trust resource and that it's managed for the public benefit and the public interest. So it's making sure that states view water resources themselves as a public trust, held in public trust, not to be privatized, not to be marketized, and that it's not, the decisions about where we allocate water are not made by price or profit, but they're made by the public interest for the benefit of people and the environment.
Elaine Packard has a couple questions, but I want to first mention, she says that the Sierra Club supports the Future of Water Act, which would exempt water and water rights from the Commodity Act. Clearly, that's a very important bill. And, you might tell us a little bit about how that's doing, if you know.
Yeah, so Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative Ro Khanna just reintroduced the Future of Water Act 2 weeks ago. This would ban water futures trading. It would clearly define in federal code that water is not a commodity for speculation. It would be the first time that water is clearly listed in federal law that water is not a commodity. Well, we don't anticipate it passing this year. We think that it's such a simple, straightforward bill. There's already things that are already exempted as commodities, like onions aren't considered commodities. New motion picture receipts aren't considered commodities. So it's adding water and water rights makes sense. And it's a simple thing that we can move maybe in a future bill in a future Congress if the election goes well, right? Like it always depends on moving things in Congress always depends on the nature of Congress and who's in charge and the priorities of the administration. So I think, but there's a chance we can actually move it. And hopefully we can move it and pass it into law before the water futures market takes off. The good thing about California getting so much rain, one of the good things is that prices have fallen for water rights and then the market tanked, right? The water futures market is not doing well. There's not a lot of activity or interest on it because California is not in that crisis. But I think that once, the rains go away, the drought comes back, which it does. We've seen California get hit by droughts so frequently with climate change that the market might take off. And they might also pursue markets in other states like Arizona, Colorado, where they have water rights. And I think that's why it makes it urgent to pass it before a market takes off, before there's so much invested financial interest in that type of model. It's so much easier to stop something before it takes off.
Yeah, if I could add that the water, because a little team of us was working on this for the Sierra Club, is that the pricing of water is based on this water district in California. And so, the pricing is kind of around the Imperial Valley is how the price is based for the Chicago Commodity Exchange. So, I mean, that little part of California is really determining that price for water.
Elaine also asked, what is your position on direct potable reuse?
Well, we don't support it. Food and Water Watch does not support direct potable reuse. We have a lot of concerns with most alternative water supply projects. We, again, think that the first thing we should do is address how we use the water instead of creating these new systems. We have concerns around risk with direct potable reuse because it's not widely used right now. I know states like Colorado, Texas, California are moving towards direct potable reuse. California just passed rules authorizing it. So projects are now being built in California and Colorado to move toward direct potable reuse. I would worry about being a guinea pig for that model. We need to think about, especially because there are huge cybersecurity concerns with water utilities, the threats that might happen with these really, what they're called like high profile, low probability risks. And with direct potable reuse, you have a system that is like it's a connected system, right? So there is no there's no barrier, there's no environmental buffer to protect against an emergency, an act of terrorism, a cybersecurity threat, a release of contaminants into the wastewater system that you can't account for with these treatment systems, a failure at one of the treatment systems. So there needs to be a lot of redundancies, fail safes built into that system, a lot of redundancies because of that lack of environmental buffer. It just poses a lot of risks. It often uses, hopefully, I think the California one will require reverse osmosis, which is the most effective treatment system, but there's a lot of contaminants that we don't track and regulate in the country. And if you're not releasing waters to an environmental buffer, there's concern that those contaminants that are unregulated and that can bypass filtration, if those filters get built up, too many contaminants like PFAS build up on the filters, erode them, some of these contaminants break through and it can actually concentrate within that closed loop system. So I think we have a lot of concerns about the risks of it. And we also think that the priority should be going after corporate water abusers before we go to alternative water supply projects. So our priority in California, and like I mentioned earlier, is just making sure that we are prioritizing going after wasteful water abuses of the oil industry, of these big agricultural and factory farms, that is the priority instead of spending all of this money on alternative water supply projects.
I'm glad to hear that. I think there needs to be a lot more pressure on the corporate water users, and I'm sure they they control an awful lot of water. Stacy asked, do we know how many foreign entities own U.S. water rights?
A fantastic question. No, we don't. No one's tracking it. There's no federal agency tracking ownership of water rights across the country. None. It's all done at the state level. And state database systems, not great. Like California, no price transparency in their water rights system. California does though mostly leases, so not actual sales. Other states have actual sales of water rights and not a lot of good information about it. There's been a lot of issues in Arizona in particular because Saudi Arabia owned a lot of water rights. The governor recently ended that deal, but it was on a state land. A lot of water rights they owned to grow alfalfa that they, it's called virtual water, where you grow a crop that uses really water intensive water crop in the US, and then you export that water intensive crop overseas. It's virtual water trade. It happens a lot. And it's a big issue because a lot of land in the US is being bought up by private equity vehicles, Wall Street firms, as well as private interests, probably foreign interests, and we just don't know because it's tracked at the state level and the databases are not great.
Stacy also asked, why is everyone always picking on California?
Oh, I don't think I could answer that. I don't know. It's at the western states in particular, though, all along the Colorado River, we're seeing a lot of private equity interests. Colorado, Arizona, and California are the ones I know most about. Where we're seeing a lot of these big banks buying up water. In California, too, there's a new groundwater market that's being launched, and we're hearing that there's a new company whose executive was associated with Enron, who's interested in buying up groundwater rights in California as it gets launched. So another thing to keep an eye on. I don't know, California is just the first water futures market. A lot of these water rights, it just seems to have a lot more water rights deals. I don't know why there's so much interest. Maybe it's because of all the big ag companies there. I don't know. It's a good question.
Well, we're getting close to the end of our talk with you, and I'm sure other people have additional questions. I urge people to look at your website, Food and Water Watch, frequently, because you got lots of new stuff that happens, and I think that we would, be proud to partner with you whenever we can.
I love partnering with you too. Thanks again for inviting me today.
Thank you.